So I said what we're going to do is we're going to start with Rhod for really just a quick 5-minute overview of why this matters, why it's so important to get the spectrum policy framework right because of the looming spectrum crunch, the increasing demands, the new business models that are going to be possible, the ability of the U.S. to really continue its leadership role in spectrum. So Rhod's going to do that, and then we'll turn it over to Richard. So.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity. I'm here today really because I serve as the executive director for the High Tech Spectrum Coalition, which is a group of technology companies that are interested in seeing voluntary incentive auction language enacted this year. And when I was asked to give just a couple of minutes to tee this up, I was thinking about this in the following regards. When I talk to my parents, I have to explain why spectrum policy matters. No one in this room needs the tutorial. So the real question is why in a Congress in a political environment where things are not moving, are we all sitting here today working on this issue? And I think the answer is because it's unique. In an environment right now where it's difficult to get anything done, actually the concept and the desire for getting spectrum policy done can actually move. And you'll hear that obviously from folks like David who are actually putting pen to paper and working on this in the Hill. And so I was just going to touch on a couple of key points as to why I think it merits people's time, both yours in this room, as well as what's happening both within the administration on the Hill as to what drives this. And the first thing, I think, is that actually often when you're talking about telecommunications policy, you get the 5 to 10 people on the Hill who are really well versed in the issue and understand it. For every one David, there are 100 folks who kind of sketchy get the idea. But in this case, the need for spectrum and the crunch that is out there is intuitive. In most offices that you talk to, whether they are the chairman or whether you're talking to the newest member of the committee or often folks off committees of jurisdiction, they get the crunch problem. They may not know the math, they may not know the Cisco analysis that says we need 275 megahertz within the next several years, or we are going to see degraded services, changing in price plans, whatever that may be. But what they do understand is they drive in neighborhoods, their bosses are in places where either there's no bars, one bar. When the earthquake happens, people figured out it wasn't the towers turned over on the East Coast, it's that spectrum demand demand for phone calls to get through overwhelmed the network. And so capacity becomes the key issue. And the only way you're going to get to capacity is both by trying to get greater efficiencies out of the technology, but also finding more spectrum. So one, in a town where you usually have to explain things over and over again when you're doing telecom policy, this one's intuitive. Second, this has the unique attribute of usually when we're looking at policies in DC, we're trying to spend money. This is one of the rare instances where you see moving on an idea will actually generate revenues for the Treasury. So at a time in which we are confronted with the budget deficits that everyone understands so well, and the Hill is particularly stuck in a vice on, along comes an idea that is good for innovation and good on a number of fronts, but can actually generate tens of billions of dollars. And some of the analysis we've done, we think actually the administration, maybe even some on the Hill, are being too conservative in their estimates. CBO has scored this at $24.5 billion in revenue. If you look at various plans for moving a voluntary incentive auction forward, we believe that number is actually more likely to be 35, 36, $37 billion. And we think that obviously has great political appeal. But what really makes this issue unique for the moment is that at the start of this Congress, I would argue spectrum policy was tied up in a budget issue. People were looking at it for revenue. But now that the economy has kind of ended up in the place that it has, we now see people interested in jobs. And so when you see the variety of reports that are coming out that are talking about that the wireless environment can generate between now and 2016 330 to 770,000 jobs just through this general ecosystem. And I can't say that's all just out of voluntary incentive auctions. I don't want to misapply what that means. But when you look at investment in 4G, when you look at new wireless networks being built, and you look at what can happen if enough spectrum is made available through something like voluntary incentive auctions, you have this incredibly appealing situation, which again I think is unique. I'm going to use that word over and over again, for the Hill to look out and say, hey, we have a deficit, we need innovation, and we need to create jobs. How many other ideas can anyone name in this room that actually check the box on each of those? Whereas spectrum policy can actually achieve that. And I think that's why it remains viable. Further proof of how unique it is, again, in such a politically charged environment, you look at the arrayed interest backing voluntary incentive auctions. It's bipartisan, it's bicameral, you have the administration and the Hill working on it, you have the House Energy and Commerce Committee working, you've had the Senate Commerce Committee already pass legislation out of its committee on a bipartisan basis. So you see all sorts of activity, and that activity is also interesting to me in the sense that it's from the highest levels to maybe some of the most junior. You have leaders like Reed introducing bill, and obviously Rockefeller moving his product with KBH, and you also have rank and file members introducing legislation on this from both sides of the aisle. So you have the administration bought in, you have a variety of players. So the issue now becomes, what is the final deal? I don't mean to equate that unique means easy, but unique does show why this continues to have momentum, and I think there's a reason to believe this can actually get done. Another element that I think makes it stand out from others is that often in DC, as we all know, there are two sides to every fight. And so when you have two sides, it becomes very difficult to move. My line has always been you need consensus and crisis to move any legislation in Washington. And consensus is hard to reach. What I think is interesting about this issue is not only is the tech industry, the wireless carriers and the folks that are interested in mobility all behind this issue, but you do have the broadcasters testifying and saying they support voluntary incentive auctions. They may have terms and conditions that they're looking for, but it is not a non-starter. It is a question of how you do it. It is not whether or not you can do it or whether you should do it. And all those things, I think, lead up to an environment in which this can get done. So I would, close with the thought that the issue before us now and what keeps us all here is just simply what's the legislative vehicle going to be and can this get done? And I would close my remarks with the following. What really makes something unique is when we were charged at the High Tech Spectrum Coalition to begin working on this issue in January of this year, our mission statement was to close it out by December 31st. Not often in Washington do you take on a job where you say in 1 year we will go from the beginning of something to hopefully seeing enactment of legislation and on the president's desk. But this is an issue where I believed from the start of this year that was doable, and even in the environment in which we find ourselves today and that these people are operating within, I think that is still doable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Richard?
Let me begin with some data. Pretty simple. I've got 6 numbers you can think about: 22,000, 8,000%, 300 megahertz, 10 hertz per user, 4 times, and 1 hertz per user. What do those numbers mean? So the 22,000 mile is miles away that communication satellites are, which when you calculate the speed of light and the time that it takes to bounce off the satellite in one direction and then come back, we have a half-second latency regardless of what the data rate is, which means that that's a system that is better for broadcast applications like TV than it is for communication applications like carrying telephone calls, which AT&T discovered immediately after the Telstar satellite was launched. The 8,000% number is probably everybody knows what that means, right? When after the iPhone was introduced, the traffic on AT&T's network went up 8,000% over the next 3 years. 300 megahertz is kind of a trick number because 300 megahertz is the amount of spectrum that's currently allocated to the 4 major mobile network operators in the United States. It's also the allocation for TV, which brings us to the next number. Only 30 million people in the U.S. now watch TV over the air. Most people watch TV from cable or telephone company equivalent of cable or from satellite services and even the internet. So we have that. So what that equates to is that each active user or each person who uses over-the-air TV is consuming 10 hertz. So that's the allocation, 10 hertz per person. And oddly enough, in this environment that we're in today, 4 times as many people already watch television from sources that originate on the internet, like Netflix and Hulu Plus, as watch TV over the air. So internet delivery of television has already surpassed over-the-air TV. And the last number, the 1 hertz, is 300 million people use cell phones in the US, so that means each of us has 1 hertz. And the entire innovation ecosystem that depends on mobile networks, that is actually that 1 hertz per user. So that's the trivia portion of our program. So let's do the report. Can we get to the first? Do I have control over
You
this?
gotta click it in.
There we go. Yeah, so in case you have to duck out early, this is the essence of it. So in addition to the 300 megahertz for over-the-air TV, there's also additional spectrum allocations actually for satellite and for the microwave backhaul, which is part of the system that delivers television to local broadcasters. Now, how did we get to this situation where we have, there's actually more spectrum allocated for over-the-air TV, which is, by any estimate, a dying application, right? I mean, there's been a slight increase actually in over-the-air television viewing in the last 2 or 3 years, but it probably has more to do with the economy than anything else. But the overall trend, you know, for the last 20 years has been successively downward. Well, we got here by a process of static administrative assignment. I mean, the spectrum auctions are now more or less accepted around the world as one of the principal means of allocating spectrum, but they haven't been practiced that long in the overall history of spectrum allocation. The traditional way that it's been done is that an administrator like the FCC or its equivalent in other countries looks at the application, at the potential applications, and considers petitions from would-be spectrum users, judges them on their merits, makes an allocation, and is done with it. And there hasn't really been anything in this process that recognizes the fundamentally dynamic nature of technology. That once an allocation has been made, you know, the regulator can't just sort of wash their hands and go away, because, you know, chances are, unless there's massive unemployment in the tech sector, somebody's going to come up with a better application to use that spectrum. And then once it's all been doled out, which essentially all the sweet spectrum between 300 megahertz and 3 gigahertz has been doled out, they're going to be in a situation where they're starved for a critical input to their process. So at a minimum, and it's kind of reminds me of Larry's fundamental law of disruption, which says that technology changes exponentially, but administrative and political processes change incrementally. And it's even worse than that, right? I mean, there are some cases in which administrative and political processes don't even change at all. And a whole lot of the engineering is actually finding ways around arcane, counterproductive, you know, regulatory situations. So we need a dynamic process that allocates spectrum on demand, essentially as applications emerge, as user interest changes, and without having to go back to the FCC, or even worse, having to go back to Congress every time there's a new potential application and beg for some resources. The one thing that we've learned, I think, in the last, say, 10 years, which is a lesson of the internet, is also a lesson of the mobile networks, is that if you build a network that is capable of supporting multiple applications, which has actually not been the historical pattern if you think about it, that networks that can function in that multiple application role are much more productive, perhaps, to use one of Larry's words, exponentially more productive than the traditional networks for television and radio and various kinds of satellite uses that are essentially single application networks. And there's just an inherently dynamic property that these networks have that allows them to adapt to changing patterns of usage. And one of the lessons of COES since what, 59, marketplace allocation is generally preferable to administrative application. And there may actually be an even better way to do things than marketplace application, but let's do everything we can with marketplace allocation first. And what I'm talking about when I say marketplace application, sort of property rights models aren't necessarily the end all and be all of spectrum policy. Because, there is a potential that technology can develop to the point where even these systems of allocation become obsolete. Dynamic spectrum access probably will become a reality at some point in the future. We just don't know when. We don't know whether that's a 5-year, a 50-year, or a 100-year process. So there has to be sort of some recognition of that. And there are obviously longer discussions of all these points that are in the report. So I thought what I'd do with the remaining time is just sort of go through the essence of the 10 recommendations in the report. And I understand I'm hoping that the panelists don't all agree with this, because this will be extremely boring if they do. And so there should be something, I think there's going to be broad consensus on these things, but I'm hoping that, I've pushed the envelope far enough to get some pushback. The single most important recommendation is that Congress should grant a permissive incentive option authority to the FCC. And when you talk to the people who are the key players in this is a consensus position. There are some differences in terms of exactly the structure of the incentive auction and how much, whether there should be one and only one voluntary television incentive auction. Most people believe that there should be, but there's a question about whether Congress should say there's only going to be one television incentive auction, or Congress should just grant the authority to the FCC and let the FCC construct the auction. I personally feel that one of the areas of expertise in which the FCC truly excels is in auction design. And especially after watching the Science Committee hearing on the light squared system last week, I think the farther Congress stays away from the specifics of technical issues, the more likely we are to get to a correct conclusion. So I'd like to see a permissive grant of authority, and then for the FCC to do the detailed auction design. And I do believe that broadcasters need a little bit of incentive to get fully involved in this auction, and they should understand that if they don't participate, there's going to be reassignment. If we were to take the 300 megahertz of television spectrum that we currently have and reduce it to 30 megahertz, with the way the technology works in terms of multiplexing and compression, you could basically have 30 television programs broadcast over the air and only 30 megahertz of spectrum. And given, patterns of usage, most people still only watch the primary big 4 channels. So I think that it's a question of reassigning the non-participants to make them share channels with each other. So instead of like one channel having 5 program streams, you have one channel that has 5 program streams from different channels. Yeah, so that's an incentive. If you look at the NTIA has a really nice multicolored spectrum map, which is in the report. The paper copy isn't color, so you don't get that, but the online version it is, and it's sort of really a good illustration of. I should have included that in the presentation, but it's a good illustration of sort of what the problem is, because you have this multicolored map with all these different applications that have been assigned tiny little pieces of spectrum. These are all application-specific licenses, and what the sort of where we are right now, we'd be all lot better off with a much smaller number of allocations for more general purposes. And ultimately, this goes to sort of the creation of. Think of the cellular network as basically one network. There are many operators in the cellular space, but it's basically one network. The different operators all interconnect with each other. There's not any sort of issue of nationwide incompatibility like there is in public safety. And that's a single network that has multiple components, and I think that, you know, that's the model to actually build on. I also raised the issue that we need another DTV transition. I think the DTV transition that we just completed a couple of years ago, basically after 15 years of planning, essentially botched the deal. And the problem is that it wasn't sort of transformative enough. So when old analog TV was the order of the day, you know, we had even more, you know, like 3 times as much of bandwidth for analog TV, and people, you know, it was a stationary application. So it's kind of, if you're a couch potato, you can't really get much more stationary than that, right? So why should your program content come to you over a system whose fundamental property is to support mobility? So I mean, that is sort of obviously squandering the resource. So to the extent that we broadcast television entertainment to consumers at all, and consumers are obviously showing the preference for personalized content, for being in control of what's in the program guide. You know, you decide with Netflix what movie, what television series you're going to watch right now. You don't leave that decision to a programming executive in New York. Why don't we look at the problem of over-the-air television in terms of the unique capabilities of the mobility of that system? And so we could vastly reduce the allocation and also increase the utility of the system by focusing over-the-air television on, how did this happen? I must have hit the wrong button there, huh? Oh, I didn't hit any buttons at all. Vastly increase the utility of it by thinking about it as a mobile system. And in fact, there is sort of a variation of the over-the-air TV standard that supports mobility, and that should be part of the thinking. But you know, we do have to recognize that we have satellite as a way to deliver over-the-air television to everyone in America, and most people still prefer to get that kind of programming over the internet. One of the issues that came up, certainly played very prominently at the 700 megahertz auction, was the fact that there were all these essentially unauthorized mobile wireless microphones like this one. I don't know, is this a legal one? Or,
we have an exemption from the
yeah,
SEC.
where it's a K Street exemption, but I mean, and they're basically asserting squatters' rights. You can't reallocate this spectrum. You're gonna, you know, it's gonna have a really bad impact on Broadway theater. But you know, these are people who are using. It's an unlawful application. So I'm not saying that we should go out and arrest all the people at Shure Microphone Company that, you know, that did that, or whoever it was. But I don't think that the law can't really recognize squatters' rights as a valid principle in spectrum disputes. And once the license for a piece of spectrum has been transferred, the transferee should be able to start using it more or less immediately without going through some hugely complicated clearing process. And I realize that's naive and easier said than done. I think every spectrum license should basically come with a time limit, which it theoretically does. I mean, the FCC doesn't actually give spectrum to people. What it does is that it grants a license for a period of time. But you know, there is a sort of a general assumption that once a license has been granted, that it'll sort of automatically be renewed. I mean, that seems to be the regime that the local television broadcasters are operating under. And certainly the easiest way to reallocate the spectrum that local broadcasters are using is, you know, when the license comes up for renewal, the FCC says, well, thank you very much. We appreciate your public service. And now we're going to go give that spectrum to somebody else. I'd love to see that. I don't much think I ever will. One of the issues that is really quite vexing, I think, is this issue of the fact that, spectrum, it doesn't behave over the air. Radio frequency energy doesn't behave over the air the same way it does in cables. And certainly in the light squared example, especially in the high precision GPS part of the light squared example, and I don't know how many people have really followed that, but there's an application that essentially uses standard GPS frequencies. Then it moves over a little bit and it uses another set of frequencies for what they call augmentation. And the augmentation signal happens to be in the middle of two swaths of spectrum that are currently licensed to light squared. So the high precision GPS guys have designed a receiver that actually looks at the entire set of spectrum from GPS down to the augmentation signal, including the light squared system in the middle, which should be filtered out, but they cut a corner there and didn't filter it. And they're saying, well, light squared breaks our system, but I mean, it's an issue of actually, as much as anything, very poor design of a receiver that worked fine in a certain scenario, but if you change, that upper 10 megahertz of the light squared allocation to a high energy terrestrial system, the high precision GPS falls over and dies. And yet, for some reason, I'm able to use 3G and GPS on this at the same time. I don't have any problems at all doing that. Well, other than the fact that telenav's directions aren't always really what they could be. But this is an area of work. We did when was it, last November, a conference here in conjunction with Silicon Flatirons on the question of clarification of spectrum rights. It's a fascinating area of both law and technology, and needs more development. And I think this is fairly this may be controversial. There's the biggest problem that the United States faces relative to the rest of the world in terms of the development of our mobile ecosystem is that our allocation of spectrum to government use is more generous than that of any other country. And so the United States, depending on whose estimates you look at, we're somewhere between 300 to 500 megahertz behind, say, Europe. And it's because we've assigned more spectrum to fairly arcane at this point government applications. And in many cases, I mean, some of those things are military, some of them are classified. But I think there's a tremendous opportunity to actually repurpose some of this spectrum that's been allocated to government uses into more general purpose networking uses, and actually get to a scenario where the government use is handled by a commercial network. And so rather than being there, the history of spectrum is that, because the initial demands were, in many times, came from organizations like law enforcement, before there were commercial networks. There are a lot of network operators in the wireless space that don't really need to be operators anymore and aren't particularly good at it. I mean, public safety built this situation where they have all these non-interoperable networks all over the country. And, the cellular guys didn't do that. I mean, why would they? Right? Because interoperability is sort of the first priority. And that whole system had to interoperate with the public switch telephone network. So you let the people whose core competency is running networks run the networks. And let the other people focus their energies on their application, on their customer, on their mission. And probably more than anything else, that helps move us forward. Which brings us to the public safety network. I know is a big political hot potato because, after all, people in uniform come up to Capitol Hill. They sit down before a hearing where, their desires to continue operating their own network are being discussed. They're in uniform. They have their medals on. How's a congressman going to say no? And in fact, the testimony in support and the arguments in favor of the continuation of what's by any objective measure a failed system. I mean, public safety networking is a failed system. They don't even make a serious argument for it. It's simply, we're first responders, we want this, you know, give it to us. The spectrum's been allocated for it, but you know, we'd all be a whole lot better off if the dedicated spectrum that's been allocated were put up for auction and the money paid for a situation in which public safety had a mobile virtual network the way that Virgin Mobile used to do before they were bought by Sprint. But you don't have to have your own network facilities to actually function to roll out an application. You have to have a contract with someone who is a network operator to roll your application out. And the contract can specify whatever performance terms you need for your application. So if you need an application in which you get priority for access to the network, say during disasters and during hurricanes and earthquakes, I mean, here we are in earthquake country, you know, that can be done. And there's a paper coming out fairly soon that deals with this issue that was written by John Piha, who was the former chief technologist of the FCC, where he does statistical modeling and measurement to determine exactly how much demand for network capacity public safety has during times of crisis. And you know, what he finds is that it's easily within the capability of networks to handle that. So there's really not a rationale for public safety to continue to be a network operator other than inertia, jobs, tradition. I mean, the applications really aren't that special. And finally, I think one of the most intriguing portions of the House bill is this notion about how we draw the line between licensed and unlicensed allocations of spectrum. And what they propose is a system that's based on a working paper that the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy at the FCC considered 2008 or so, working paper 43, that talks about an auction system for actually deciding what sort of licensing policy should be applied to a particular piece of spectrum. So the details of that, I'm not going to really develop that a whole lot, but I think the thing that's really important about it is that in the era of auctions, there is still an administrative decision being made by regulators in terms of deciding what spectrum is going to be auctioned and which spectrum is simply going to be granted on an unlicensed basis for applications like white spaces, ultra wideband, and Wi-Fi. And you know, nobody loves Wi-Fi any more than I do. Personally, I was one of the people that in the early 90s was the group of engineers that sort of put the system together. But even I recognize that of the 600 megahertz that's been allocated for unlicensed use by Wi-Fi, there's only 75 of it that are actually being seriously used today. And if there is a marketplace way to make the distinction or to make that decision about what's going to be sold and what's going to be given away for free, or there are ways for the Treasury to actually capture some of the value that things like Wi-Fi generates, I'm all for it. I'm not completely convinced that we have such a system right now. But the fewer administrative decisions the FCC has to make about spectrum, I think the better off we all are. And so those are my 10 recommendations. And you can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, read our blog. You can even see this event will be on YouTube in probably a couple of days. And with that, I think I'll take my criticism from the distinguished panelists. And thanks for coming again.
Larry, Richard, you want to pass the mic over?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Richard, for this really excellent paper, which I think demonstrates the value of having engineers talk about engineering problems. Cuts through a great deal of baloney and in a really useful way. So I'll just give you the headline here. I disagree with two of Richard's recommendations, but with reservation. I think the most important thing that Richard points out, and it's at the executive summary, but the real meat of this is sort of buried in the back of the paper, is that this discussion we're having about spectrum reallocation is not a one-time discussion. That in fact, even if we do have the authority to do the voluntary incentive auctions and we reallocate much of the spectrum currently assigned to broadcast television, that's not going to solve a long-term problem. And that in fact, as Richard says, what will happen is that the accelerating pace of change of this technology will in fact make it a more difficult problem going forward rather than one that's going to get easier. Now, in Silicon Valley, we consider that good news in the sense that what we've seen over the last 10 years in particular is the emergence of a new kind of network. It's based on the non-proprietary standards of the internet. It is digital and it is virtual. And we all know from a consumer standpoint the results of that set of remarkable sort of historical and technical accidents. We have seen all manner of network being swallowed by the internet, including television and radio and computing networks, both personal, business, and so on. We've seen the development of the mobile ecosystem. I remember not too long ago when people laughed about the sort of 3G because there were no applications for 3G, but everybody talked about 3G. Well, now of course we have billions of downloads of 4G apps on a yearly basis, and all we can see is that the numbers are increasing. So I think Richard is dead right to say that what we're actually evolving towards is essentially a completely virtual network, where new applications and new devices will attach themselves based on these non-proprietary standards at an accelerating rate. And as I say, from a consumer standpoint, that's good news. From an economic standpoint, that's good news as well. The problem is, from an administrative standpoint, it does draw into question, I think, the sort of fundamental basis on which spectrum allocation has been done up until this time. And I don't suggest any criticism here of the FCC or any other national government's approach to spectrum. I don't think this was something anybody could have predicted was going to happen even 10, 12, 15 years ago as the internet started to make its ascendancy as a viable commercial alternative to proprietary networking standards. But the problem is an institutional one, and again, it's not a criticism. There are very good reasons why, as Richard quoted my law of disruption, there are very good reasons why government, regulatory and legislative, as well as judicial, move on an incremental basis. In most cases, deliberative processes are what we want government to do. But when we have this collision of the deliberative nature of government and the open and exponentially changing nature of digital innovation, we get a lot of collisions. And as Richard suggests, those collisions are going to become more intense and more disruptive going forward, not less so. So I think, the sort of image that Richard starts to paint is one where ultimately, due to technology and engineering, it really doesn't matter. All spectrum will be unlicensed spectrum in the sense of all devices will be able to figure out what's available to use at any particular time and do so. We have a long way to go technically before we would start to see that kind of environment, but maybe not as long as we might think. So from that standpoint, I think Richard is certainly right that we need to go ahead with the voluntary incentive auctions as quickly as we can. That's going to get us over perhaps the immediate hurdle and the immediate problem that we've got in the mobile ecosystem. But long term, it's only the beginning of a much more complicated and difficult process. This, I think, is where I have my first disagreement with Richard. In some sense, Richard walks himself to the brink and then steps back from the edge when he says that the licenses should only be for 5 years. if it's true that government agencies are poor at deciding when a particular application has outlived its usefulness, or certainly from a cost-benefit standpoint, when other uses might be better and higher, the sort of putting a 5-year clock on licenses is inviting a great deal of political and administrative interference with the evolution of this ecosystem. Why not better, Richard, to trust the very free market that you put so much faith into elsewhere in the paper and say, let's not put any time restrictions on the licenses, but let us make a extremely robust secondary market a viable one by removing as many restrictions as we can on the existing licenses, so that as the free market finds new and better uses for the spectrum, the market will work its wonder and those licenses will change hands when the appropriate time happens. Now, there might be situations, you sort of think of this as extraordinary rendition. There might be situations where an existing application or an existing set of uses collapses very quickly and is supplanted by some alternative. And I don't actually think this is literally what happened with the pager market, but obviously at a certain point, pager technology, which was a standalone application using its own particular frequencies, was overtaken by the mobile system, which, as I say, was absorbing all these other applications and all these other uses very quickly. Why not allow that to, if that had happened in sort of a much more quick way, you might think, well, all right, so we can say that market has collapsed, let's reclaim that spectrum. But I think by and large, the secondary market, if we made it more robust, would do a much better job than putting short fuses on these licenses. Second point, which I disagree with Richard, is on the public safety network. Now, Richard makes an extremely annoying point. It's annoying because it's very hard to disagree with, which is that no matter how good a job we would do building a standalone public safety network, it would never be as flexible, it would never be as innovative as the public network. We already see how, again, new devices and new applications show up just based on market forces. And it would be very difficult to imagine that a standalone public safety network would ever have the same technological or application capabilities as Richard says, what an 11-year-old would have to compete with. So that's annoying because it's true. There's that seems very likely to be the case. I think the two problems, one is a technical one, or at least the perception of a technical problem, would be that the ability for the public networks to build in whatever safeguards and capacity and other backups that would be necessary to handle the public safety network during emergency situations would either be too difficult or at least be perceived to be too difficult in order to just, as you say, make that a virtual network riding on top of the public networks. And then the second problem is obviously the political and practical one that you mentioned, which is the police, again, the perception that public safety needs a separate network and wants its own network, it wants its own allocation, whether it appreciates or not how that's going to restrict their functionality in the future, is going to make it very difficult for anyone to go along with that particular recommendation. So perhaps in that sense now I'm stepping back from the brink of my own convictions in suggesting that the public safety network should in fact stay separate, but I think that's probably the more realistic possibility. So I'll leave it at that. I think those are my two, main complaints about the paper. But otherwise, the other 8 recommendations, I'm with you on those.
So my main complaint about the paper is that it wasn't written before the broadband plan was written, because I would have preferred to have had it then. And it is kind of interesting from an historical perspective. If you go back and you look at the first record and the NOI that greeted me when I arrived, actually 2 months after that came out, it was a very, very much of a wireline sensibility, and we changed it. The broadband plan was very much of a ecosystem sensibility, and the critical point was we followed where the consumers were going, and consumers were clearly choosing mobile. We followed those trends, trying not to make mistakes of only listening to ourselves, and that's why we thought that the single biggest risk for the broadband ecosystem 10 years out was lack of spectrum. And I should be much happier about the progress that Rhod is making, since I was actually in the room when we invented incentive auctions, which, by the way, I had a really stupid name for it, which I will never reveal, but John Leibowitz fortunately came up with the name incentive auctions, which I think was much better. Let me make a couple of very quick comments about where I disagree with Richard. There are kind of certain details. I agree with Larry about the time issue. I agree there should be a second digital television transition, but I would frame it quite differently. Though one reason I wish Richard had written his paper earlier was it would be nice to have the broadcasters attack someone other than me and make me seem like the moderate. But I think we need one because I think we need to move toward MPEG-4, and I think it's ridiculous that we haven't forced the broadcasters to give us a plan to do that. Because they're eventually, here's what's going to happen, precisely what happened in the late 80s, where they're going to say, oh, we need all this spectrum in order to make this conversion. Let's do it now. Let's talk about it right now. Because actually, that conversion is a spectrum saver, but we're not pressuring them. We're not doing our job, and we really need to have that as part of an overall movement of spectrum. Which, as Larry said, the critical insight that John really came up with, and I totally agreed with in the early days of developing the broadband plan, was we need a plan for reallocation. Spectrum auctions, which I had the pleasure of working on in the early 90s, was really about allocation. But the spectrum's all been allocated. So we needed to come up with a system, and it's, in retrospect, as you say, it's totally bipartisan and everyone agrees with it. But I would just note, it's the first time in the world anyone's proposed a reallocation system that's market-based, and we got to move forward. I disagree with Richard on Wi-Fi because I think we as a country should commit a certain amount to that shared space. That's a bit of a leap of faith. I can't make an economic argument except to say that unless we make a commitment that's not subject to a certain kind of economics, I think we're going to miss an innovative opportunity because it's kind of a different type of ecosystem. And so what the amount of that space is, I think, is a debatable point. But I really think we ought to commit firmly to that space and not let it be overtaken. But the bigger issue that I'll just very quickly say as to all of this really goes to what is the role of the FCC as an expert agency? And one of the more distressing elements, while I can be very happy about the fact that spectrum auctions, I hope, will eventually come, and I can be happy that the Commission will adopt a universal service proposal that in some ways may be based on what we did and all that. I'm very distressed by the extent to which the role of the FCC as an expert agency seems to be continually undercut. When we thought about incentive auctions, we thought the legislation should be one sentence long. The FCC shall have authority to share proceeds with any spectrum licensee who wishes to contribute that spectrum. Every sentence that Congress has added is, in my view, counterproductive. Now, I'm not a purist. I understand the politics. I understand they have to add some language, so I'm not being totally critical. But I am saying, since we're in a think tank and we can think, and we ought to aspire to think clearly, let's understand clearly, every sentence that's added is not designed to improve the likelihood of the success of the spectrum auction. The FCC, they're complicated things. I agree with Richard. It's one of the things the FCC does best, and the people who do it are the best in the world. Give them the freedom to just go out and do that. That should have been adopted like a week after the spectrum plan came out. Similarly, on the D block, the FCC we made a decision. We didn't think the public safety guys needed it. You can argue about that, but Congress, if you want to reallocate it, one sentence. That's all you need to do, and you should just go ahead and do it. One of the things that I think is most unfortunate for the country is that D block has been lying idle for a long time. The FCC should have just gone ahead with the auction, said, Congress, if it wants to reallocate it, great, you all do it. Because, we could adopt the auction rules today, we're not going to an auction for 12 or 18 months. If you change the allocation, obviously there's no auction. So I think that we're not understanding the opportunity cost. Having that spectrum lay fallow every day costs this country jobs and economic growth. And so let me just close by saying that something that's unrelated, but I think is kind of in the similar vein. There's a proposal on USF today that actually I think has a lot of good in it, the so-called ABC plan. But one of the things that I don't like about it is it makes a technology choice. It says the FCC should give USF on a basis of first right of refusal for incumbent wireline providers. And I just don't see why we don't, and this, just tying it all together, one of the things we did right in the 90s was we listened to where the market was going. one of the things we did right in the broadband plan was to listen to where the market is going. When you make a judgment that the incumbent has a superior right to something like USF, as opposed to listening to where the technology is going, or where consumer preference is going, you're losing your credibility, I think, as an expert agency, and that's unfortunate. Again, I understand the politics of it. That may be part of a package that, perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good. But I really hope that the FCC, and this, by the way, is no criticism of Rick, who I think is doing really an outstanding job in ways that only people who work at the agency can know. But the FCC really has to reestablish its authority as that expert to make those kinds of decisions, and they need to convince Congress to let them do that.
Well, obviously I'm going to have a slight disagreement with Blair on the amount of language in the bill. I will go up on incentive auctions. I think the language we've added does add to the incentive auction legislation. And I think Rhod hit the nail on the head in his opening when he said the nice thing is that this discussion has not been should we do incentive auctions. It's now how do we do incentive auctions and how do we make this a reality. There are some really important distinctions that both the Senate bill and the House Republicans and House Democrats have added in language that comes later. For example, in the House Republican version, I stand behind my portion that says that you have to have downward pressure on the reverse side in an incentive auction. It's simply punting all the authority to the FCC to structure an incentive auction. An incentive auction with one license available on the reverse side and many bidders on the forward side. We don't need the FCC to do that. I mean, we could have Sotheby's do that. I mean, that's a simple, straightforward forward auction. We think there should be pressure on the reverse side to make sure that it doesn't become simply a way for licensees to extract the most possible from their position. If there's a reason for them to get out of the business and there's a reason for them to offer a license in a voluntary incentive auction, we think that there should be competition for those dollars to get out of the market. And we think that was an important distinction to put in our discussion draft. On D block, I'm going to go the other way. 0 sentences. We need 0 sentences in our drafts to deal with the D block. House Republicans, this has been taken care of, right? In 2005, this was decided. D block was to be auctioned for commercial purposes. I think that our bosses on the House Republican side have been pretty clear that they are still of the belief it should be auctioned for commercial services. Obviously, there is disagreement within Congress and even within our subcommittee across the aisle, but at the end of the day, the public safety folks have 24 megahertz that was allocated for them in response to the 9/11 Commission's report solely for their use in 2005. And it was delayed in 2007, but by 2009 it was cleared. And folks are starting to build out through the waiver process broadband in that spectrum, and we're happy to see that they're moving forward. We think that both sides of the Hill seem to agree that one of the most important things we can do in the public safety space is ensure that that spectrum is used in a way that furthers national interoperability. And that's the one area that everyone seems to agree is that a strong governance model should be put in place in order to make sure that we don't end up repeating the mistakes of the past. The LMR world works great for LMR, for the land mobile radio side. We saw that after the earthquake a couple weeks ago, right? The one thing we heard right afterwards is this is justification for why we need more public safety spectrum. Well, nobody in the public safety space was complaining that their voice communications weren't working. I think it was Politico that put a story out right afterwards. It said, it had a nice juxtaposition for us. It had the FCC talking about the congestion in the commercial cellular networks next to a quote by Kathy Lanier saying, our systems work great here in DC for the police. So I think, if anything, a lesson that we learned from the earthquake is that commercial networks are spectrum constrained. And that sort of brings me to one of my disagreements with Richard. And I think that's the one thing that a lot of us disagree with Richard on, is that public safety is tough to make just a pure application on a multi-use network. There's a reason that Congress allocated spectrum specifically for this purpose. And I think we saw that play out. Commercial users were enraged that they could not get their calls through after the earthquake. If you have a shared network between public safety and commercial, you at some point have to make a balancing decision. How much of that capacity are you going to give to public safety, and how much of that capacity are you going to give to commercial users in times of crisis? Because you will exceed the capacity of any network in times like Hurricane Katrina or 9/11 or any mass disaster. And inherently that balancing decision is going to be difficult at best to make. I think ensuring that the public safety guys get to use the 24 megahertz that has already been allocated for them in a way that makes sense for public safety nationwide is something that our bill has been trying to come to terms with. And we've had lots of negotiations over the last couple of months, as my bosses have said, with our Democratic colleagues in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, trying to bring together the two drafts that we saw before our hearing. We are making progress. We're moving forward, and we're excited about the fact that both House, Senate, Republican, Democrat, everyone's talking about the three sort of main focuses for spectrum for this year, which is incentive auctions and bringing more spectrum to the commercial space, public safety governance and ensuring they get a broadband network that's nationally interoperable, and improving the government relocation process. And I'm going to circle back again to another one of the touched subjects there, which is unlicensed. I think there's been a lot of confusion as to what we were trying to say in the House Republican version on unlicensed spectrum. In our staff discussion draft, we had the section which called for unlicensed auctions along the lines of Working Paper 43 from the FCC. And I think this has been taken to mean that House Republicans think there should be no more unlicensed spectrum, period. That's not certainly what we meant at the staff level when we wrote the draft. Our concern at the staff level is with allocating spectrum for unlicensed as a primary use. And the vast majority of the unlicensed out there now is a secondary use of some sort. And we certainly think that's a great place for additional unlicensed use. A lot of folks out there have said you need a good mix of licensed and unlicensed. We agree. But when the FCC has in the past done primary allocations for unlicensed, unlicensed PCS, it hasn't been a place that has had a lot of build out. And that'll bring me back to sort of my last criticism of Richard's paper, is that I think we need to bear in mind that incentives matter, and I don't mean that in the incentive auction context, I mean that in the licensing context. Incentives matter. The renewal expectancy is one of the reasons we have nationwide wireless networks. If we expect an industry to sink billions upon billions of dollars a year into producing a nationwide network, they're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They expect to make a return on that investment. There's a reason we don't have nationwide Wi-Fi networks that are as robust as nationwide commercial wireless networks. And so as we move forward and look at dynamic spectrum access, which we've been hearing about for years as a panacea of spectrum, and God help us, I hope we get there, where dynamic spectrum access is something that's ready for prime time. We need to bear in mind that as we move forward, there's going to be a place for exclusive use licensed spectrum if we want the kind of investment in networks that we see today.
Can I just clarify? David and I actually agree on the D block and the plan. But
Yes.
I was just making the point that if Congress was to act, all they needed was one sentence, and they should move forward. And the lost time, it's really the opportunity cost argument. As to the other, we can either debate it or not, but those are good points. And I would just point out the 3 points that you're talking about, all which were in the plan. I think that it's a great thing you guys move forward on it, and it's great that at least on this issue. And I think the plan process was a valuable effort in kind of creating a consensus about these issues.
Thank you, and thanks Richard for this and ITIF for this interesting panel and great paper, which really added to the debate. And I think one of the most exciting things about being here, as I was listening to all the panelists, is that we're talking about spectrum, and we're talking about spectrum at a pretty high level. And it's not just because we have experts in the room or journalists here who really understand the issue, but it's, and I think this is one of the great contributions of the broadband plan, is it really puts spectrum back on the map in a way where we weren't talking about it in that way, where people are now, average folks who don't really deal with this issue very often, are thinking about it. It's in front of them. It's great that on the Hill in Congress, they're debating the issues, they're thinking about the issues. Folks off each committee are thinking about the issues, are understanding the issues. I think it's incredibly important. I think just to pause for a minute and think about where we've come, and for those in the industry, it's not just our small group anymore, but it's a wider debate. And I think that's a very important contribution to the plan, and what's going on at ITF and other organizations to sort of bring this to the forefront, I think is incredibly important. As far as the paper is concerned, it does a couple of really interesting things, I think. In my view, we have to look at spectrum policy in two ways. One is short-term fixes to a long-term problem we've created. And a long-term problem we've created, I think, as most panelists have said, for good reason and for understandable reasons and for institutional reasons. Some that are problematic that we should fix, some that was just it was a time and an age where that made sense to treat spectrum policy in that way. We have the benefit of now almost 100 years of this policy, and it's time that we attack it. The problem is if you just go with long-term, very complicated solutions, which are important, you sort of miss the short-term opportunities. If you think too short-term, you end up back in the problem that we were in today, which is seeing just what the problems of today are. So today, for example, and I think this is part of the point of the paper, we look at the commercial wireless networks and mobile broadband as the most important thing. Well, in many senses, I mean, that's what we're faced with today, but we don't know what the technology of tomorrow and what down the road is. So flexible use is an incredibly important thing that we've been talking about at the FCC. It's a big part of the broadband plan, and I think underpinning a lot of the paper, which is creating an allocation where flexible use can govern which way we go. We don't have to make the constant 5-year decisions as to what is the best, whether it's through licensing or another mechanism. At the same time, the beauty of incentive auctions is it is taking a short-term step that we can do today to move the ball forward. That also doesn't, I think, undercut our long-term goals. It's a small step forward, but actually achieves, without going in a side direction, that can actually achieve what we want to achieve, I think, long-term. And it's got a lot of support. Hopefully it goes through and hopefully it happens. Longer term things like spectrum rights and renewals and another DTV transition, very important to think about. And I think it's something the FCC and NTIA, Congress all need to be thinking about very carefully. And I think they actually all fit together, so you can't kind of address one without the other. But I think the paper addresses all of the key issues and gives us a lot for further thought. One of the most difficult problems, and anyone who's been talking to me lately knows that this is what I spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about, is finding ways to undo what we've done, and that can be incredibly complex. And I think one thing the paper is missing, and it shouldn't have actually, but to inject it in, is just the political and practical realities that I know Blair ran smack into, and David deals with every day, which are taking the incumbents and figuring out how to make people work together. So it's either the broadcasters who you could understand, I don't want to be moved, what's in it for me. The incentive auctions was actually designed to say, actually, there's a lot in it for you. You can actually, as opposed to being forced to move, you can actually get a lot of money out of it. It seems great for the broadcasting industry to me, make a more vital broadcasting industry. And then, and we see in the Light Square GPS conversation, the challenges of new services coming in and trying to make the most productive use of spectrum, yet having technical challenges and sort of incumbent problems that have developed over many years that have been allowed to happen in ways that have left us in a difficult spot as we're trying to kind of break through and implement a lot of the core ideas, I think, of Richard's paper and a lot of the folks at this table who've been thinking about these things for a long time. The way I look at the paper and this sort of issue is in different boxes, and I'll just very quickly point out what I think, just to add to the conversation that I think Richard started here, which is the FCC, and to build on what Blair said, it is an expert agency, and somehow it's sort of really gotten sucked into the political process, maybe even more lately than it has in the past. It's always been there. Blair dealt with it, as chief of staff in the mid-90s, but in a way that I haven't quite seen it before, which is we actually are an expert agency, and I can say from an interesting perspective, having been at the FCC for 2.5 years, so not very long compared to many who have been there for 20 or 30. The people at the FCC really know what they're doing. The engineers who have been there a lot longer than I have, I've just joined the family, so I can't take any credit for this, but it's actually pretty impressive. And so, I do say to David and others on the Hill, the more we actually have been there a long time, been doing this for a long time, really think about this very honestly. It's a non-political process, and the more flexibility we get, the better. And this actually applies to the FCC too. When we enact rules, just like when Congress passes laws, if we're not thinking about all the consequences, and very often we don't know them at the time, so you can pass a law today, but when you're finally implementing it in 5 years, you miss half the things. And that's the difficult thing that Congress faces. And when we implement a new rule on an issue, I bet you there's something we might not have thought of, and we got to work our way around. The nice thing about giving the FCC flexibility is at the moment it's going to conduct an auction, it has flexibility right up into that moment, and also to operate within the auction. So, an auction is not a process that takes one day. It's not, you don't, go to the auction house and there's an auctioneer in one day, a couple hours and you raise your card. It doesn't, obviously doesn't work that way. It's many times a multi-month process. So we actually make adjustments in the course of an auction. So my only, request is that as we, think about these things, giving us maximum flexibility is the best way to ensure that we get the most money for the Treasury. If we want to use it to build out a public safety network, that's terrific. That you'll get the most money for that. Create competition among broadcasters so that that we're not overpaying because obviously there's some have a problem with even giving any money to broadcasters. So which ensuring we're creating that sort of competition, all very important. But I see the FCC's role as creating this box in which the playing field for flexible use is. The one thing I would add to the conversation is the FCC also needs to be concerned about competition. So the box only works if somebody doesn't get all the spectrum, right? So you have to ensure that there's some measure of competition. So we sort of set the rules and let everyone play within that space. So you really want to ensure that there are enough players to put it in the right hands for the right reasons. So in other words, if one player had it and can knock everyone else out, that obviously would be a challenge. The other challenge is the specific uses, and David addressed this, but public safety, utilities, federal uses, DOD, et cetera, railways. It's hard to figure out how to account for those. So while you want to be auctioning spectrum, there are certain public uses that we actually need to figure out how to fit into the system where there's just certain public policy goals that are important. But at the same time, that's a struggle because you also want to ensure that you can easily go down the road we've gone down, which is just saying, okay, you go here, you go here, you go here, we miss out on opportunity. And then finally, just to throw out there very quickly, which we deal with very often, is technical issues. So this LightSquare GPS, but just in general, you have to think very carefully about your band plans. And so the FCC has a very important role, as NTIA does here, to think about what fits together with what, because you can't. And in a very well-functioning market, that actually would probably work out itself. And the engineers have said, well, of course, we're not going to put a high-powered use next to a cellular network. But figuring all that out, at least at the moment, the FCC has a very important role to play there. And so we also have to think about that as we think about this debate. Thank you.
I just wanted to clarify real quick also. I don't think that all of the language you see on Capitol Hill that is policy language that sort of couches the terms of what the FCC could do with an incentive auction should be viewed as some condemnation of the FCC or a lack of faith in the FCC. I think everyone would agree if there's only we can disagree on criticisms of the FCC in general, but I think if there are two things we can all agree on, it's that Julie Knapp and his team in OET are some of the most well-respected engineers in DC, and that the FCC really knows how to structure and run an auction. I mean, that's a fact. We've seen a lot of money come into the Treasury as a result of auction authority. I don't think it's the fact that the Hill disagrees with your ability to get it done, but the fact of the matter is it is a political process, and there are political realities to be dealt with on Capitol Hill, and at the end of the day, the FCC derives its policymaking authority from the Congress, and members have not forgotten that. So, as we expand into a space like incentive auctions, which is an area that is, brand new, worldwide, really brand new. We're on the forefront of that in this country. I think there are certainly members that are concerned that the process be done in a way that it fulfills the goals that the Congress has in store for the incentive auctions without unduly restricting the FCC. I don't think it has to be one or the other. And I think our draft, quite frankly, puts a lot of faith in the ability of the FCC to get it done. There's a lot of question marks that are left for the FCC to fill in when it comes to, I think, all the drafts, to be honest.
So, and I agree with that. And just the one thing I just want to highlight for everyone to think about is the worst outcome is to pass incentive auction legislation that is not done calibrated in the way you're talking about, and then we conduct an auction that fails. That then sets us back many, many, many years. So just, luckily we have people like David who think about these issues very seriously and understand them. And just the flexibility to the point where we know that we can actually develop an auction that will succeed and raise a lot of money, so we don't maybe have to go back for a second one necessarily, or then we've actually done a disservice. So that's the only thing I want to flag, but I know you're well aware of that.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I can push back a little bit on the criticisms, and that's always more important to me than stuff I got right. And then we want to have some time to take questions from the floor. On the public safety side, bear in mind that sharing is really kind of the fundamental principle that makes the spectrum that we have as useful as it is. If each of us essentially has 1 hertz of spectrum, right? And if I insist that I'm the only person that can use my 1 hertz of spectrum, and everyone else insists the same thing, then I'll have perfectly reliable communication at, maybe 3 bits per second. under ideal conditions, and that's all that anyone's going to have, and so there aren't going to be any high rate applications. And this system works because we each take that 1 hertz and essentially pool it with other people, and so we end up with, you know, the 1 hertz turning into 300 hertz megahertz that can be used on demand, because, you know, we don't all need it at the same time. So it's sort of on demand reallocation dynamically is actually what takes place, right, in mobile networks, and that's, you know, where the system gets its utility. And I understand that one of the problems with taking the public safety network and making it a mobile virtual network is that none of the network operators want to be on the spot to be hosting that network, you know, in case under some conditions it doesn't really perform, you know, the way that public safety wants it to. So it's an interesting quandary where the 24 megahertz that public safety has will actually, I think, be more useful to them if it's pooled with other spectrum, but that they have priority access to. And the technical means of ensuring that one particular user has priority access, and so under times of stress it would actually become dedicated to that use. Those are not difficult technical problems. I mean, actually, Wi-Fi can do that. Okay, it's not an engineering problem. There's another criticism that I'm not politically, the recommendations are not politically sensitive enough. Well, there's kind of a reason why I'm working for a think tank and I'm not a lobbyist. You know, it's just, I mean, I figure it's my job to articulate the correct policies. And it's the rest of y'all that have to go convince the politicians that the correct policy should actually be enacted. And that's what makes Washington so much fun, and Sacramento too. Yeah, the arbitrary time limit of 5 or 10 or whatever it is, there is a contradiction between the idea of arbitrary time limits and fully dynamic reallocation. And I think I'm going to really take that to heart and see if I can't come up with a better solution to that problem. But and it's all, but one of the contradictions, or Rick pointed this out, that that there are certain, you know, kind of innate technical properties that that the different types of networks have. It's not really applications, but when you're bouncing a signal off a satellite that's 22,000 miles away, and then it comes back to Earth, and it, you know, and that signal has to cover the entire United States. The energy level at which that signal, you know, comes back to Earth is inherently so much less. I mean, one of the analogies is the energy would be like a teaspoon of water compared to Niagara Falls, where the mobile networks are Niagara Falls. But of course, I guess there are restaurants at Niagara Falls where people can drink water, and somehow it seems to be isolated from the stuff that's going over the cliff, which actually came to Earth as raindrops to begin with anyway. There are ways to deal with that problem, but when at first brush, as a technical issue, you'd sort of like for all your satellite networks to be more or less contiguous, or all your low energy network space, you'd like for that to be more or less contiguous. You'd like for your terrestrial stuff to be more or less contiguous. But you look at the spectrum map today, and it's like for every, and I run down this list, for every application that has been granted spectrum, there's a satellite equivalent of it. And I think there's a huge amount of redundancy in that. And this is the real critical problem. The reason I didn't go in much detail is because it would end up being a 1,000-page paper if you look at how you undo all the stuff that has been done in the last 100 years on spectrum allocation that made sense at the time. Made perfectly great sense at the time, but now it's a question of how do you undo that. And so it'd be so wonderful if you just sort of have like a 5-year moratorium on all uses of spectrum and just sort of wipe the slate clean and start all over and figure out, you know, what the rules should be in different frequencies. And then we could have auctions auctions can take place under the framework of there's some sort of level of omniscient assignment that has to be done, and then the auctions, I think, where we are right now, can function most efficiently.
If you can find a way to undo history, we should also apply to the Middle East.
You know,
I
there are
mean,
a
it's
lot
the
of,
same problem, right?
Yeah.
You have competing interests of historical nature.
mm,
And there's reason both spectrum and the Middle East will be amongst us always.
well, and there's only one Doctor Who, you know, after all. And he works for the Brits, so I mean, you know, we can't even really rely on him. So, you know, what are we gonna do about that?
Richard, if I could chime in for a second, I wanted to double back on your discussion on sort of sharing of networks between public safety and commercial. It's going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but incentives do matter, and I think that's what we've tried to set up in our discussion draft. I think from the staff level, when we started looking at this problem, we envisioned sharing between public safety and commercial providers, and quite frankly, so did the FCC when they tried to auction off the D block the first time. The problem was with the first D block auction, the incentives weren't there. The FCC asked the commercial users to blindly go ahead and bid on a piece of spectrum, and then don't worry, you can go talk to the Public Safety Spectrum Trust later, and you guys can set up a way to share networks. Well, commercial guys had no incentive to do that. They were pretty sure from what public safety had said at that point that it was going to be an unlivable set of circumstances if they were handed down to them. We've tried to learn the lesson that we saw in that D block auction and apply it to what we're looking at in the public safety governance model. And I think that's one thing that both sides are looking at. There is certainly utility to be had by sharing between commercial and public safety users. And, you know, I think we've all heard public safety folks say, why is it that the 16-year-old I arrest with an iPhone has more communications capability than the police officers do? Well, the reason is the commercial guys have competition, which drives them to innovate. So we're trying to bring the innovation of the commercial sector to bear on the real problems that public safety has with communication. But the only way to do that is to make sure that they can sit at the table together and actually both have skin in the game. So we tried to set it up in our discussion draft so that you have public safety users with their 24 megahertz of spectrum that we would transition to full broadband use over 10 years, and some amount of grant money to build out in tandem with a commercial provider. And the commercial providers bring the thing that's been missing in public safety space for so long, which is the innovation incentive. And you know, LMR is great for push-to-talk radio, but if you want the kind of innovative applications that public safety says they want, they're going to need to try and get on the wave of LTE innovation that's out there now and continue to ride that wave and not stagnate with one technology that they've picked for the next 20 years. We think that working and making it so that both sides have reasons to sit down at the table and negotiate with each other and say, you know, maybe public safety, since you have such, I believe it was described in our hearing as lumpy use of spectrum, they have incredible demand in times of emergency and very low demand most other times. Why not set up a sharing arrangement? And vice versa. You know, commercial providers have a lot, at least the nationwide guys, generally speaking, have a lot more spectrum than an individual police department does right now. So why not set up a system whereby they can negotiate with each other? And yeah, public safety may be able to strike a deal with a commercial provider who says, I'll give you access to a percentage of my network in times of emergency in exchange for access to your network in quiet times. We think that's a real market solution that could work, but it only works if you don't hamstring one side or the other.
Well, I don't know why nobody is, maybe it's too soon, it'll be next week. Somebody should propose maybe public safety should just buy T-Mobile. I mean, I think they can get a deal, you know, and they'll be good to go. So that's not serious. Do we have any questions? Eliza?
Sorry, Dave, I'm gonna pick on you.
Surprising.
Okay. I think everybody will be interested in this, though. Can you give us a sense of where the negotiations are in terms of what might end up in the deficit reduction bill in terms of incentive auctions? I mean, the tech community has been speaking for you, saying that this is going to be in there. So that'd be my first question.
You know,
This is the off-limits question.
yeah, you know, the thing is, it'd be premature of me to discuss anything that's going to be done by the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction. They're just getting into their work, and it would be premature of me to comment on it.
Okay, so another question for you then. On the white spaces issue, you said that it shouldn't be a primary use; it should be a secondary use. So explain to me how that works, or how you know if you're going to have the option to use white spaces if there isn't a carve out for other legislation. Just flesh that out a little more.
So I should double back and be clear. One thing that I think sort of gets lost in the shuffle is that no matter what you say about our unlicensed provision, whether you love it or you hate it, it won't have any impact on the existing 700 megahertz white spaces. That's in law. We're not trying to undo the existing rules that the FCC has put in place, and that's just how it is. That will stay as it is. Quite frankly, it's the kind of thing you would envision, though. White spaces are a secondary use. At the end of the day, if the FCC decides to license a full power broadcaster in a white space, the white space guys are out of luck, and they knew they were getting into that situation, right? They knew they didn't have an exclusive license for that spectrum. That's along the vein of what we're envisioning here. You shouldn't have the FCC, particularly in a world of incentive auctions. Our staff, we don't see a reason for you to spend auction proceeds to clear spectrum and then give the asset away. If you're going to spend the money to clear the spectrum, you should be getting a return on that investment for clearing the spectrum. And that's really what we were looking at with that provision.
So, Michael? Oh, maybe you should identify yourself.
Mike Marcus, occasional blogger. I agree with many of the suggestions, disagree with a few, but the fundamental issue is, do you think FCC and NTIA is presently structured are capable of resolving these points that you raised?
It's an interesting question, and I think one of the there have been suggestions that Larry Lessig and various other people have made over the last few years that there's something askew about the FCC's mission, right? That the FCC is a regulatory agency, but what we're finding is that many of the questions that the FCC and NTIA are actually asked to deal with are questions about innovation policy. And the way that our FCC is structured is not the only way that an agency of that type can be structured. I'm an advisor I'm on an advisory panel that the government of Singapore has, where they have an agency called the Infocom Development Authority, which has the regulatory function that the FCC has with respect to broadband policy and spectrum, but they also are charged with innovation policy. And Singapore, being the most innovative economy on earth, is highly dependent on having a productive innovation policy. And in fact, the reason they have an economy at all is because of their ability to innovate. They don't have any natural resources. It's a very small country. But IDA does that, carries out those obligations very effectively. And I think this is a much larger subject actually than the paper about spectrum policy, but I think these questions are really in the background. Do we want the FCC to continue to be an agency that is simply a regulator, and certainly some of those regulatory functions with respect to language and speech on broadband visual images during Super Bowl halftime shows are among the aspects of the FCC's mission, which I think that they get way too much attention, and I don't think there are a lot of people in the FCC that are sitting around worrying about how they can, about America's moral fiber. I mean, we've got entire sets of institutions to deal with that. But the innovation function and making these decisions, in a way that actually increases America's innovation readiness, I think is critical, absolutely critical. But the FCC doesn't have the power to simply redefine its mission. And so we're talking about the next version of the Communications Act. And the guy that wrote the last one is grinning, and he understands, how difficult that's going to be. But certainly a redefinition of the FCC's mission is part of this conversation, should be. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
Actually, no.
Yeah.
By which I think it's a really good question, Mike. And I'm sure you actually do have some insight into it. I guess I won't comment on the FCC. I will say that one of the things I've been thinking about, actually more since I've left, is how NTIA itself has to have more power with other agencies over spectrum. And there are a variety of ways you can do that. But, NTIA, I think, this is just kind of conceptual, needs to have the same power that the GSA has about a different kind of asset. So that there's all kinds of efficiencies I think that can be had if you had a more centralized power powerful force, and that instead of just playing referee, it should actually play landlord.
Mr. Hussey.
Yeah, Matthew Hussey with Center Snow. I guess to follow up on Mike's question, I mean, what are the thoughts of the panelists about a consolidation of power to one sole authority, similar to Ofcom, that has, you know, sole authority of management of spectrum assets by both commercial or federal and non-federal users? Because certainly there's been several GAO reports in the past that have highlighted the problems that exist with this, you know, bifurcated model. Any thoughts to that? Being none.
So the way we currently function is that the FCC has control over the commercial use of spectrum, and NTIA has control over government use of spectrum. Only the NTIA is kind of more of a stenographer, I think, than a primary allocator. Because how do you get it back once it's been assigned?
Right. I mean, not to make a policy recommendation, but I mean, Matthew, what you point out, I mean, it's something I put in the long-term bucket that I described before, which is looking at Ofcom or even Industry Canada in Ottawa. You know, one challenge you will have is you can dividing commercial and federal as one is in many respects a very arbitrary distinction. There were again reasons for it being made, but and we can continue that direction. You can consolidate, and then there's the imbalance that Blair pointed out, which is the FCC is sort of the ruler of the domain, and commercial you don't have. Actually, there's no, you know, as Richard pointed, there's not NTIA is not an equivalent, whether it's NTIA or GSA or something else. That doesn't. So what you have on the federal side is sort of each agency being the ruler, sort of its own federal spectrum policy. And you know, NTIA serves a coordinating function, and then you know, you could redo that, and as Blair points out, and you could, you know, depending upon, but you know, that would be a major change in the way we did policy. But clearly there are other options than the system we currently have, and you know, others can point out the problems with the current system.
From our perspective, in terms of changes at the FCC, the only thing we have in the shoe right now is our FCC process reform legislation, which we'd be happy to talk about, Matthew.
Maybe a little more narrow, I think, than what Matthew has in mind. So everybody get their first question first, then we'll do the second.
Okay. Leslie
Michael Marcus actually should have been on the panel here today.
All right. Leslie Taylor, consultant and recent staff person at NTIA, and former staff person at FCC, and long time in the private sector as well. I'm really happy to hear more discussion about NTIA. There are a lot of people I run into ask me, there's still an NTIA? I mean, it's been such a quiet agency that people don't even know it exists. And it's correct that NTIA does not have control over the federal agencies. And in essence, my view is that they are a recorder of deeds. And that is a really serious problem, and it doesn't give them the opportunity to work or have, I don't want to say power over the agencies, but maybe some kind of moral suasion over the agencies to move the ball forward. However, I personally like the fact that NTIA is a part of the Department of Commerce. In my view, while I was there, we had two clients at NTIA. One set of clients were the federal agency. The other set of clients is the American people. And NTIA has a role as set forth in the legislative enabling law that that says it should maximize the benefits of this resource for everyone, the federal agencies. So it can have more of a policy-making role, but I think buried down at the Assistant Secretary level at Commerce, that really makes it very challenging. Thank you.
So we're running out of, we've actually exceeded our time.
The former head of NTIA is going to follow up on which is not mistaken, but I think there is a disconnect in the thinking of the relationship between NTIA and the agencies. In many ways, is very, very similar to the relationship between the FCC and its licensees. The The FCC cannot, by fiat, go to existing incumbent licensees and say, I want that. That's why we're talking about incentive options, creating the right incentives for existing licensees excuse me, to give back what they have or to trade what they have. It's a very similar relationship with the agencies. And when we've been successful in creating the right incentives, the Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act, we come up with things like AWS, which was 60 megahertz, no, less than 45. That was a $9 billion auction. So it's not as simple to say that NTIA has no control over the agencies. It's simply to say that the agencies, as effectively licensees, have the same similar kinds of expectations that commercial licensees have. And the way that the FCC relates to them is not entirely different.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have. And thank everybody for coming, and I hope we've given you some food for thought.
Actually,